We need to get all the crap out, and then eventually our ideas fertilize. And I'm gonna leave that there because I think you know where I'm going with this metaphor. Hola y'all, it's your girl Shelly Flowers, aka Michelle Flores, and writing inspiration. Let's talk about it. So, like many of you, I have found a lot of difficulty in writing at various points in my life for a variety of reasons. As of late, it seems to be that caring for children, grading my students' work, lesson planning, taking care of household chores, all of these things tend to take precedent. And even though writing is one of the deepest desires of my heart, it oftentimes gets pushed to the bottom of my to-do list. Now, there's a variety of reasons for this, but I think the main one is the fact that I tend to be a mood writer. And I think poets oftentimes tend to write in this way. We wait until the muse happens upon us, and then when we feel like inspiration has finally struck, we take the time to write something out on a sheet of paper or type something up on our computer. And that's the only way we feel like our writing experience is real. But let's be honest, the muses get busy sometimes, and oftentimes they can't just focus on one person. They've got other things to do, other people to see. So I've been thinking up some ways to help create my own inspiration, and I wanted to talk about them in this video. Now, even though this is a poetry-focused video, I do want to clarify that a lot of these hacks can be used for other genres of writing, be it nonfiction, fiction, screenwriting, and so on. I think you just might need to tweak a couple of these tips here and there, but overall, writing is writing, and practicing good writing is pretty typical across the board. So here are my 5 tips I want to share with you that I think will help you find your own inspiration in your own writing. All right, let's go ahead and jump in. So, tip number 1. This one is pretty basic and not particularly groundbreaking, but I think it needs to be said because they can be super helpful. That tip is attending a generative writing workshop. So for those of you who don't know, a generative writing workshop is essentially a writing workshop where the goal is to create a piece of writing. In this case, I'm talking about poetry, but I also know they exist for fiction workshops and so on. Oftentimes workshops tend to focus on more of the critique aspect of things, but there are plenty of workshops that also focus on the creation aspect of things. I myself have attended a few of these live in my own city. So Facebook is a great resource for this. I don't think anyone's uttered that sentence in a very long time, but in actuality, I have found a lot of events in my community that focus on literature and writing workshops and things of that nature. So I would suggest hop on your Facebook page, check out and see, are there any workshops happening in the near future? Now, given that we are currently in the state of quarantine and we really can't go out into our communities, or some of you might live in really rural areas where there might not be as big of a literature community, I would highly suggest that you look on YouTube. I have seen so many generative writing workshops popped up. Some of my favorites come from an independent publisher based out of Los Angeles called Not a Cult Media. They have published books from one of my favorite poets, Jessica Salgado, who actually leads a few of these workshops herself. So you can literally go onto their webpage. They have recorded these Zoom meetings that they conducted for these generative workshops, and it makes you feel like you're actually a lurking participant within the workshop. And so it guides you in a step-by-step format on how to create different kinds of poems. Jessica Salgado I mentioned before, but you also have Jose Olivares there, you have Kate Cordero, you have Rhiannon McGiven. I think that's how you pronounce her name, so I do apologize if I mistakenly pronounce that. But with that being said, there's also workshops for fiction writers, nonfiction writers, and so on. So if getting into a live generative workshop is impossible for you for the variety of reasons that we have, YouTube is a great resource for this. Hack number 2. Again, this one is not that complicated and it's gonna sound really basic, but hear me out. Read. Read a lot, read often. I think so often on AuthorTube in particular, I see such a focus on productivity that I think sometimes we forget, aside from producing, as creative people, we also need to consume. We should be reading the works of people that we admire. We should be reading the work of people that challenge us. This reading is gonna much more deeply enrich the work that you're creating. And I say read, but I also mean read with a more critical lens. Don't just read for enjoyment. Instead, think about the techniques that the author's using. How do they structure their repetition? What kind of form is going on in their poetry? Can you actually see some type of thematic element being portrayed throughout all of their poems? If you read a whole bunch of Mary Oliver books, you might realize that you have some perspective on pastoral poetry that you might not have had before. Or conversely, if you read something that is completely experimental, like a John Ashbery or a Lawrence Ferlinghetti, maybe that will push you to become more experimental within your work. I think the main thing to keep in mind with the reading is that it should serve a specific purpose. And maybe you're not going to create, maybe it'll be a couple months before you actually start writing again, but in that time you're studying, you're learning, you are reflecting on the types of techniques that these poets are using, and eventually you're going to want to emulate that within your work. Conversely, you might not want to emulate that. Instead, you might want to respond to it through a different lens. So reading, again, not groundbreaking, not something brand new that somebody's going to tell you, but I think reading with the mindset of a writer and not just for entertainment can really push your work in a lot of different ways. Step 3. I firmly believe that creating a writing ritual for yourself can definitely help the inspiration flow. So here's what I mean by that. Oftentimes when we write with a purpose of trying to hit a specific word count or trying to create a specific type of writing. Like maybe you want to get one poem done or you want to have a certain number of lines within your poetry done. I think by establishing these oftentimes arbitrary goals around our writing, we limit the creative expression that we can release, right? So by creating this writing ritual for yourself, you are allowing your mind to relax, you are allowing your emotions to flow more freely, and you are allowing yourself to not be limited by constraints. So when I say create a writing ritual for yourself, I literally mean set the stage for yourself. Think about what kind of mood you want to get across in your poetry and create a situation where you can do that. Some examples of the things I've done in the past. I tend to like to write really late at night, usually past midnight. So once my entire family's asleep and the house is all quiet, I go out into my eating area, turn on some candles, put out a plate of fresh fruit, maybe some cheese, pour myself a glass of wine, play some ambient mood music, and this dim atmosphere with like the alimentos off to the side and things like that, it really does help me set the stage for the kind of poetry that I want to write. And it just makes the entire process so much more special. And I think to some extent, I sort of trick my brain into realizing when I start doing these things, that means I'm gonna write. By being more consistent with it, it does help me get more ideas out when I create that ritual. Your ritual might look different. Perhaps you need to go out for a long walk and bring a notebook with you. And just the action of walking helps release some of those ideas from your mind. Maybe you need to binge on a lot of TV because that's your way of like consuming before you actually write. I don't know. And I think everybody's ritual is going to be different for themselves. But at the end of the day, I think the goal for having this writing ritual is to create some kind of consistent pattern for yourself, while also tricking your brain into thinking this is going to be like a relaxing event or an event of release, not just a productivity goal you have to get to by a certain amount of time. I will also say this is not something I do every night. It's impossible for me to stay up past midnight and get some of this done. So it's really important that I stay as consistent as possible while also recognizing that this is probably like a once a week kind of thing for me. Tip number 4. I actually find that this tip has been the most helpful for me in not just helping me write more, but also affecting the way in which I write. And this is writing in a received form. Now, I will say that this is probably something that is mostly exclusive to poetry because received forms are very common with poetry. When I talk about a received form, I'm talking about things like sonnets, sestinas, villanelles, But it can also be more modern received forms, such as a golden shovel or an ABC daring, even acrostic poems. All of these forms of poetry have specific rules to them. So you have specific meters you need to follow, specific syllable counts, specific rhyme schemes. And by forcing yourself to focus on structure rather than content, I think it creates this really interesting tension within your writing. I like to think of writing received forms as almost like drills before the big game. So even though I use received forms quite often, and I tend to use Spanish received forms like letrillas and pie quebrados, the only received form I've ever published was a villanelle, and the only reason I decided it was okay to get published was because I used Spanglish in it and I made it my own. So I think that's the big key with a received form. Figure out how you can make it your own. What is going to set your sonnet apart from the hundreds of millions of sonnets that are out there in the world? But also recognize maybe that's not your goal. I think a lot of times with writing, we have to remember that sometimes we just need to get the garbage out. We need to get all the crap out, and then eventually our ideas fertilize, and I'm gonna leave that there because I think you know where I'm going with this metaphor. So just keep in mind that simply creating this practice of writing in a specific form regularly will really help out your writing later on. I've seen this happen in my own writing. I used to be the kind of person who wrote in very short, blocky texts, and I showed that in my editing blog, which I'm gonna link above. But overall, that is not really the style of writing that I do anymore. I very rarely write prose poems, and instead, a lot of my poetry features so much repetition, some playing around with rhyme scheme, a big focus on rhythm, and a lot of that is due in part to the work that I've done to use more received forms within my writing. So, just to reiterate, received forms, in my opinion, are not just the end goal. Like, your goal should not be just to create a sonnet or just to create a villanelle. Instead, it should be almost like a drill or like practice within your head, and help you think about the ways that you can play with structure, with rhythm, with sound to create a more, I don't want to use the word sensuous because it's kind of a creepy word to me, but almost like sensuous experience, like a very sensory, there we go, sensory experience within your work. Okay, hack number 5, and I will say this hack I think works in particularly well if you're someone who's trying to write a complete book of poetry, but you're completely at a loss of where to start. This is called investigative poetry. Now, you're probably familiar with the term investigative journalism, where essentially a journalist will look at a particular topic and do a whole bunch of research on that small sliver topic and then create some type of report. Investigative poetics works very similarly. I learned about this from Amy Catanzano from the North Carolina Writers Workshop in spring of 2019. And it was fascinating. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it, but I had just never heard it expressed in the way that she explained it. And she herself is a big proponent of this style of writing. So essentially, take the idea of investigative journalism and apply it to poetry. You pick a topic first. Rather than trying to look for a common theme in poems that have already been written, you start backwards. You pick a topic, you research the crap out of that topic, and then you actually write about that topic in a creative way. So in her case, she wrote a whole book called Multiversal, where she invented what she calls quantum poetics. And she looked at the ways in which quantum physics and language intersect and created some really beautiful, interesting poems out of her research. I'm linking the book down below, and if I can find them, I'll also link some poems that she wrote from this project down below. I got to hear her read some of these poems live, and it was really beautiful. She talked about the way the universe was formed, and it was clear that she knew so much about the topic, but she was able to express her ideas on it in such a beautifully creative way that I didn't feel like I was sitting through a physics lesson. Another writer that I would suggest, I don't know if he would use this term to describe his work, but I think it could be applicable here, is Olio by Tahimba Jess. I talked about this in my poetry video, which I'm linking above as well, but this book is a magnum opus, and it is another beautifully well-researched, heartbreaking work of poetry, where he essentially talked about the Reconstruction era, post-Civil War in the United States, and vaudeville acts, and focused particularly on freed Black people who were sort of forced into performing in these vaudeville acts because realistically getting work at that time would have been extremely challenging. You can tell that this work was so deeply researched to the point where so many of the poems look like historical documents. The characters were based off specific people in real life, and it's a book that took me a month to read. Poetry never takes me that long, but that's how well done this book was like I just felt like I was learning so much as I went through it. So I highly suggest checking out those two books if you're interested in this idea of investigative poetics. I will also say though, I don't think that you necessarily have to create an entire manuscript using this technique. It could also be that you just create like one poem or maybe a group of poems based off of the research that you conduct. I am linking the manifesto for investigative poetics down below. Yes, there's a manifesto. This was a movement that occurred in the 60s, right during the beatnik movement and gonzo journalism, and everybody had a manifesto back then. So if you are interested in reading more about it, I'll definitely be linking it down below. Okay, so those are the 5 techniques that I suggest if you are struggling with finding inspiration in your poetry. I myself have used all of these techniques to some degree, and I find that the overall quality of my work is vastly improved because I've taken the time to stretch my writing muscles in these very different ways. I think another big thing to keep in mind with this though is that your writing is not always going to be good, and that's okay. Remember, nobody writes a perfect first draft ever. Everybody can improve on their work, and the more that you take the time to practice different techniques, to try different writing styles, and to really push yourself in the boundaries that you're willing to go in terms of your writing, the better your work is going to be. I have noticed this happen within my own work. You know, 10 years ago, I might have been in an MFA program, but I was nowhere near ready to have any work published. And now I've got a chapbook out and I've worked on a full-length manuscript. I was a finalist for a National Poetry Prize. So I really do suggest that you take the time to really push yourself with the different techniques that you're using. Don't just wait for the muses to fall, and don't just focus on arbitrary goals like word count or line count. Instead, focus on different approaches to actually getting your ideas out on paper. Okay, so that's it from me today. If you'd like to follow me on a more day-to-day basis, you can find me on Instagram, Tumblr, and Goodreads at Shelly Flowers. If you'd like to purchase my own book, Cuentos from the Swamp, it's poetry all about growing up in South Florida. You can find the link in my description down below. And if you have other techniques that you would like to suggest, I would love to hear them. Again, these are techniques that have worked for me, but I know everybody has a different way of writing. So please, please share it out if you can. All right, ciao y'all.